Before this story begins, understand one thing. What you're about to hear is not just history, it's a warning. If you want documentaries that go beyond headlines and expose how fear, power, and silence truly operate, subscribe now and stay with this channel. Watch closely, comment with your perspective, and turn on notifications so you don't miss what comes next. These stories aren't made for passive viewing. They're made for those willing to look deeper and keep coming back. Before the violence had a name, before fear became ritualized, before beheadings turned into messages, there was a city quietly breaking apart. Nairobi in the late 1980s and early 1990s was a place of contradiction. Modern buildings rising beside collapsing social structures, political promises layered over daily abandonment. The official narrative spoke of progress, development, and post-colonial stability. The lived reality, especially for the urban poor, told a different story. This is where the story must begin, because movements like Mungiki are not born from chaos alone, but from absence. The absence of protection, dignity, and future. As rural families migrated into the capital in search of work, Nairobi's informal settlements expanded faster than the state could or would respond. Neighborhoods like Mataa became cities within the city, dense with life yet cut off from services. Clean water was scarce, electricity unreliable, sanitation nearly non-existent. Police patrols were rare unless they came to extract bribes. Schools overflowed, hospitals underperformed, and entire generations grew up knowing the city not as opportunity, but as survival. In these spaces, the state was not a presence. It was a rumor. Young men were the most exposed to this collapse, too old to be protected, too young to be respected, and too poor to be heard. They inhabited a permanent waiting room with no exit. Jobs were scarce and often reserved for those with connections. Political leaders visited during election seasons, promising roads, security, and opportunity, only to vanish once votes were counted. Over time, cynicism hardened into something more dangerous, resentment mixed with longing. People did not only want money, they wanted meaning. They wanted to belong to something that acknowledged their existence. It is within this vacuum that Mungiki first appeared, not as a terror organization, but as a narrative. Its early language was not about killing, but about restoration. It spoke of cultural pride, of returning to traditional values that colonialism and Western influence had supposedly erased. To young men who felt stripped of identity and power, this message was intoxicating. It reframed their suffering as injustice and their anger as righteousness. Poverty was no longer failure. It was evidence of betrayal by corrupt elites and foreign ideas. The power of this narrative cannot be overstated. In communities where Christianity had become associated with political hypocrisy and where the legal system felt distant and hostile, Mungiki's rhetoric offered an alternative moral order. It promised discipline in a world of disorder, structure in a place defined by improvisation. For those who joined, it felt less like entering a gang and more like stepping into a brotherhood that finally saw them. But ideology alone does not sustain a movement. What truly allowed Mungiki to take root was its ability to fill practical gaps left by the state. In neighborhoods where police never came, Mungiki members resolved disputes. Where landlords exploited tenants, they intervened. Where transport routes were unsafe, they enforced order. At first, this authority was welcomed. Fear had not yet replaced trust. People complied not because they were terrified, but because something was finally functioning. This early phase is often ignored in simplified retellings, yet it is crucial to understanding what came next. Mungiki did not conquer territory through brute force at the beginning. It embedded itself socially. It learned the rhythms of daily life, the unspoken rules, the personal histories. It knew who owed money, who was vulnerable, who was desperate. This intimacy made resistance difficult long before violence became public. The Kenyan state, meanwhile, oscillated between denial and indifference. Authorities dismissed Mungiki as a fringe cultural group or a temporary youth movement that would fade away. This miscalculation allowed the organization to consolidate quietly. By the time officials recognized the threat, Mungiki was no longer a loose collective. It was a system with internal discipline, hierarchies, and enforcement mechanisms. For many members, joining was not a radical decision, but a gradual one. A friend invited them, a cousin vouched for them, an elder encouraged them. Each step deeper brought benefits, protection, income, respect. Leaving, however, became unthinkable. Loyalty was no longer symbolic, it was existential, identity fused with survival. What makes this origin story unsettling is not how exotic it is, but how familiar. History shows again and again that when institutions fail, alternative powers emerge. They may wear the language of culture, religion, or justice, but their foundation is always the same: unmet human needs. Mungiki's rise was not an anomaly unique to Kenya. It was an extreme expression of a universal pattern. By the mid-1990s, Nairobi had unknowingly crossed a threshold. The city still looked the same from above, but on the ground, authority had begun to fragment. Law was no longer centralized. It was negotiated block by block. In that environment, Mungiki did not need to declare war. It simply needed to exist, to be consistent where the state was not, and to wait. The tragedy is that by the time fear replaced trust, it was already too late to separate the movement from the conditions that created it. To destroy Mungiki would eventually require overwhelming force, but to prevent it would have required something far more difficult: dignity, inclusion, and accountability. This is the uncomfortable truth at the heart of the story. Mungiki did not emerge because Nairobi was too violent. It emerged because Nairobi was too unequal, too silent, and too willing to look away. What began as a promise of identity soon hardened into a system of control. As Mungiki expanded beyond scattered neighborhoods, it transformed from a loose cultural revival into something far more rigid and dangerous. The language of tradition remained, but beneath it a machinery of obedience was being built, quietly, methodically, and with irreversible consequences for those who entered. Initiation was the turning point. New recruits were not simply welcomed, they were remade. The process varied by location and period, but its purpose was always the same: to sever the individual from the outside world and bind them to the group through fear, secrecy, and obligation. Oaths were sworn in private ceremonies, often involving blood, symbolic acts, and declarations of absolute loyalty. These were not symbolic gestures. They were contracts enforced by death. To break an oath was not a personal failure. It was a crime punishable by execution. The psychology of these rituals was deliberate. By participating, recruits crossed a moral line that could not be uncrossed. They were made complicit from the beginning, sometimes required to witness or participate in acts that ensured silence forever. Guilt became a chain, fear a lock. From that moment on, leaving was no longer a matter of choice. It was a matter of survival. Leadership within the sect understood something fundamental about power. Belief alone is fragile, but belief reinforced by terror is resilient. Mungiki leaders positioned themselves not only as commanders, but as custodians of a higher order. They claimed spiritual authority, cultural legitimacy, and moral superiority over both the state and Western institutions. Obedience to the group was framed as obedience to destiny itself. This structure created a closed universe. Information flowed inward, never outward. Members were taught that journalists lied, police deceived, churches corrupted, and families outside the sect could not be trusted. Isolation was not accidental, it was strategic. The less members trusted the outside world, the more they depended on the group for meaning, protection, and truth. Inside this universe, violence was normalized long before it was publicized. Punishments for disobedience were swift and severe, even in early stages. Beatings, forced labor, and disappearances enforced discipline internally, while the threat of execution ensured long-term compliance. Importantly, these punishments were often carried out by fellow members, binding them together through shared responsibility. Once someone had enforced the rules, they became invested in the system's survival. Women and families were not exempt from this structure. While Mungiki was male-dominated, the consequences of membership extended far beyond the individual. Families of members were protected or targeted based on loyalty. Wives and children became leverage points, silent hostages in a broader system of control. This made defection nearly impossible. To leave was not only to risk one's own life, but the lives of everyone connected to you. The rejection of Western influence, once framed as cultural pride, evolved into something more extreme. Christianity was denounced as a tool of colonial domination. Modern education was portrayed as moral decay. Even basic civic participation was discouraged unless it served the group's interests. In this worldview, the Kenyan state was illegitimate, its laws meaningless, its authority artificial. Only Mungiki's rules mattered. This absolutism gave the sect a frightening efficiency. There was no room for debate, no internal dissent, no gradual reform. Commands were followed not because they were questioned and accepted, but because questioning itself was forbidden. The group did not need to persuade its members, it needed only to remind them of the consequences. What makes this phase especially chilling is how invisible it was to the outside world. While communities sensed Mungiki's growing influence, few understood the internal mechanics that made it so durable. Authorities saw a criminal group forming, but underestimated the depth of its ideological grip. By the time police operations began, they were confronting not a gang, but a belief system fortified by terror. For many members, the realization came too late. What they had joined to escape poverty and invisibility had become a prison with no walls. The same structure that once offered protection now demanded absolute sacrifice. Loyalty was no longer mutual, it was enforced. Identity was no longer empowering, it was suffocating. This transformation, from cultural revival to death-bound sect, was not sudden. It unfolded gradually, each step justified as necessary, each escalation framed as defense. By the time beheadings would shock the nation, the internal logic that allowed such acts had already been perfected. The story of Mungiki at this stage is not only about brutality. It is about how fear can masquerade as faith, how tradition can be weaponized, and how people searching for dignity can be trapped by the very thing that promised to restore it. When the violence finally became visible to the outside world, it did not arrive as chaos. It arrived as a message. By the early 2000s, Mungiki had crossed a decisive threshold. Terror was no longer an internal enforcement tool, but a public language. Beheadings, mutilations, and ritualized killings appeared in streets, alleyways, and riverbanks across Nairobi, not hidden from view, but deliberately placed to be found. This was not random cruelty. It was communication. To understand this phase, one must abandon the idea that violence was driven by rage or loss of control. Mungiki's brutality was calculated, symbolic, and pedagogical. Every killing carried a lesson. Every body told a story. Heads left on roadsides were not merely acts of murder. They were warnings written in flesh. The message was simple and unmistakable. Authority had changed hands, and defiance would be answered with annihilation. Public beheadings were especially potent because of what they represented. Decapitation erased identity in the most literal way. It stripped the victim of recognition, dignity, and memory, while simultaneously elevating the killer's power. In communities already shaped by fear and silence, these acts shattered any remaining illusion of safety. The body was no longer private. Death was no longer hidden. Terror became communal. What made this strategy effective was its predictability. Violence was not indiscriminate, it followed rules. Those targeted were often accused of betrayal, refusal to pay, cooperation with police, or challenges to Mungiki's authority. This created a cruel clarity. People knew why someone was killed, even if they never spoke it aloud. That knowledge disciplined entire neighborhoods without the need for constant bloodshed. Fear, once established, sustained itself. The placement of bodies mattered as much as the act itself. Victims were found near markets, transport hubs, water points, spaces tied to daily survival. These were not chosen at random. They were the arteries of community life. By staining these spaces with death, Mungiki ensured that terror followed people into their routines. Fear was no longer episodic, it was permanent. Rumors amplified the effect. Stories traveled faster than facts. Some killings were exaggerated, others misattributed, but all served the same purpose. People whispered about what Mungiki was capable of, about secret punishments, about disappearances that were never explained. In this atmosphere, silence became self-defense. Even those untouched by violence altered their behavior, avoiding questions, avoiding attention, avoiding resistance. The state's response only deepened the crisis. Police operations were often brutal, erratic, and opaque. Suspected members were rounded up, disappeared, or killed without trial. Entire neighborhoods were treated as hostile zones. For residents, this created a devastating dilemma. The state was violent and unreliable, while Mungiki was violent but consistent. Fear alone did not drive compliance, predictability did. As a result, terror became normalized. Children grew up hearing about beheadings as cautionary tales. Parents warned sons not to speak too much, not to ask too many questions, not to cross invisible lines. Violence was no longer shocking, it was instructional. It taught people how to live, where to walk, who to avoid, when to stay silent. This is the most disturbing aspect of Mungiki's public terror campaign. It did not aim to kill many, it aimed to control all. A single beheading could silence hundreds. A single mutilated body could shut down an entire transport route. Violence, in this logic, was efficient governance. There was also a ritual dimension to the killings that cannot be ignored. Some acts were framed internally as purification, punishment, or sacrifice. This language reinforced the sect's belief that violence was not criminal, but necessary. Killing was not an act of hatred, it was an act of order. This moral inversion allowed perpetrators to operate without hesitation, convinced they were enforcing justice rather than committing atrocity. For outsiders watching from a distance, the brutality seemed incomprehensible, almost medieval. But within the context of abandoned communities and fractured authority, it followed a cold logic. When law disappears, terror often takes its place, not because people crave violence, but because fear works where legitimacy fails. Media coverage intensified the impact, even when unintended. Graphic descriptions, headlines, and images spread Mungiki's reputation far beyond its immediate reach. Each report reinforced the myth of omnipresence. People began to believe the sect was everywhere, watching everything, capable of anything. This perception mattered more than reality. Power thrives on belief. By this stage, resistance was nearly impossible. Community leaders who spoke out were silenced. Witnesses vanished. Journalists faced threats. Even naming the group aloud felt dangerous. Terror had succeeded in what no ideology or promise could achieve alone: total psychological domination. Yet beneath this apparent invincibility lay a fragile truth. Terror must constantly be renewed. Fear fades if not reinforced. And each act of violence, while powerful, also exposed Mungiki to scrutiny, backlash, and eventual confrontation with the state. The same beheadings that secured obedience also forced the government to act, setting the stage for an even bloodier chapter. This phase marks the moment when Mungiki fully revealed itself, not as a cultural movement gone wrong, but as a governing force built on fear. It ruled not through consent, not through belief, but through the certainty that disobedience would end in death. By the time fear had settled into daily life, violence was no longer the most important source of power. Control was. What truly transformed Mungiki from a feared sect into a parallel state was its grip on the ordinary systems people depended on to survive. In neighborhoods where the government barely functioned, Mungiki did something far more effective than terror alone. It organized life itself, then charged for it. In parts of Nairobi, especially in informal settlements like Mathare, access to water, electricity, transport and basic security had always been unstable. Pipes were illegal, cables improvised, and services unreliable. For years, residents had survived through informal arrangements, favors, and small-scale corruption. Mungiki stepped into this chaos not as a disruptor, but as a manager. What the state failed to regulate, the sect standardized. Water became one of the first pillars of control. In areas without consistent municipal supply, Mungiki members took over access points, hoses, and storage tanks. They decided who could draw water, when, and at what price. The fees were often exorbitant, but refusal was not an option. Water is not a luxury. Once Mungiki controlled it, obedience followed naturally. People paid, not because they supported the group, but because survival demanded it. Electricity followed a similar pattern. Illegal connections had always existed, but under Mungiki's influence, they became organized monopolies. Cables ran openly, protected by fear. Those who tried to bypass the system faced punishment, sometimes violent, sometimes merely intimidating. Darkness itself became a tool. Entire blocks could be cut off as collective punishment, reminding residents who truly controlled the switch. Transport was where Mungiki's economic power became impossible to ignore. Public minibuses were the arteries of Nairobi's working class, carrying millions of people every day. Control of routes meant control of movement, money, and information. Mungiki imposed fees on drivers, owners, and conductors, enforcing compliance through threats and targeted killings. Strikes were broken. Competitors were eliminated. The result was a system where fares rose, wages fell, and fear rode alongside passengers every morning. What made this system so effective was its predictability. Unlike the state, which appeared sporadically and often violently, Mungiki was always present. Payments were due on time, rules were clear, punishments were consistent. This created a brutal stability that many residents, exhausted by uncertainty, learned to navigate rather than resist. It was not loyalty, it was adaptation. Protection rackets extended this control into every corner of daily life. Shop owners paid to avoid vandalism. Landlords paid to keep tenants compliant. Even informal vendors were taxed for the right to sell. These payments were framed as security, but the threat was implicit. The danger you are being protected from is us. In this way, Mungiki monetized fear itself. The sect's authority also reshaped social order. Disputes were no longer taken to police or courts, but to local enforcers. Decisions were fast, final, and often violent. This parallel justice system reinforced the perception that Mungiki was not just a criminal group, but a governing body. It collected revenue, enforced rules, resolved conflicts, and punished dissent. In many neighborhoods, it did everything the state was supposed to do, except protect human rights. Women and children felt this control in quieter but equally devastating ways. Household budgets shrank under constant extortion. School fees went unpaid. Water money replaced food money. Fear entered domestic life, shaping decisions about where to live, when to travel, and who to trust. Children learned early which names not to say, which routes to avoid, which questions not to ask. For the sect's leadership, this economic web served two purposes. First, it generated enormous revenue. Second, it created dependency. Once communities relied on Mungiki-controlled systems, removing the group would mean immediate collapse. This made large-scale resistance unlikely. Even those who despised the sect feared the vacuum its absence would create. The Kenyan state's attempts to intervene often backfired. Police raids disrupted services without replacing them. Crackdowns removed visible enforcers but left the system intact. Corruption within law enforcement further blurred the lines, as some officers allegedly accepted bribes or collaborated selectively. For residents, the distinction between criminal authority and state authority became increasingly meaningless. This is the core tragedy of Mungiki's economic dominance. It did not rely solely on brutality, but on necessity. It turned poverty into leverage and infrastructure into a weapon. By controlling the mundane details of life, it ensured that fear did not need to be constant. It could rest quietly beneath routine, emerging only when challenged. By this stage, Mungiki no longer needed to display bodies to prove its power. The absence of water, the shutdown of transport, the sudden darkness of a neighborhood were messages enough. Terror had matured into administration, and yet this very success planted the seeds of its downfall. Economic control left paper trails, patterns, and victims willing to speak once the balance of power shifted. The more Mungiki governed, the harder it became to hide. The sect had built a state within a state, and history shows that parallel states eventually collide with the real one. This chapter marks the moment when Mungiki's rule became total, not because everyone feared it every day, but because everyone depended on it. Fear ruled not through spectacle alone, but through the quiet certainty that life itself passed through the sect's hands. When fear and money had secured control on the streets, power inevitably looked upward. The next evolution of Mungiki was political, and it was here that the story became most dangerous, not just for the communities trapped beneath it, but for the legitimacy of the Kenyan state itself. Violence no longer served only to discipline neighborhoods or extract revenue. It became a bargaining chip in a much larger game, one played in campaign offices, police headquarters, and behind closed doors where accountability rarely reached. By the early 2000s, Mungiki was no longer invisible to politicians. Its ability to mobilize young men quickly, intimidate populations, disrupt transport, and enforce silence made it a force that could influence outcomes far beyond the slums. In a city like Nairobi, where elections were often decided by narrow margins and turnout in poor neighborhoods mattered, Mungiki represented something politicians both feared and coveted: organized coercive power. Publicly, leaders condemned the sect. Privately, allegations mounted that intermediaries approached Mungiki commanders with offers, money, protection, selective enforcement, in exchange for security, crowd control, or intimidation of rivals. In this shadow economy of politics, the line between criminal violence and political strategy blurred almost completely. Mungiki was no longer just reacting to power, it was being woven into it. Election periods intensified everything. Political competition sharpened ethnic divisions, revived old grievances, and lowered the threshold for violence. In this climate, groups like Mungiki thrived. Their ideology already framed politics as a zero-sum struggle, and their members were conditioned to obey orders without question. When violence erupted, it was often difficult to tell whether it was spontaneous, orchestrated by the sect, or quietly tolerated by those who stood to benefit. The post-election crisis of the late 2000s marked a breaking point. Kenya descended into chaos, and Nairobi became one of its most volatile centers. Killings, forced displacement, and retaliatory attacks tore through neighborhoods already scarred by years of fear. Mungiki was accused of participating directly, sometimes as an aggressor, sometimes as an enforcer, sometimes as a tool deployed by political actors who would later deny any connection. What followed was not justice, but a purge. Faced with international scrutiny and domestic outrage, the state moved aggressively against Mungiki. Police operations intensified, but their methods raised disturbing questions. Suspected members were arrested in large numbers only to disappear. Bodies appeared in morgues without records. Families searched for sons who never returned. Human rights groups documented patterns that suggested extrajudicial executions rather than lawful enforcement. For many residents, this created a cruel paradox. The same state that had ignored Mungiki's rise now unleashed overwhelming violence in its name. Communities were trapped between two forces, both capable of killing, neither offering real protection. Trust, already fragile, collapsed entirely. People learned that survival depended not on justice, but on staying invisible. Politically, Mungiki became disposable. Once useful, it was now an embarrassment. Leaders distanced themselves, narratives shifted, and the sect was reframed solely as a criminal menace. This selective memory erased uncomfortable questions about collaboration, complicity, and opportunism. The story became simpler: the state versus the sect. Reality, as always, was far more complex. Inside Mungiki, this period shattered illusions. Members who believed they were serving a higher purpose saw how quickly alliances dissolved, protection vanished, loyalty was repaid with bullets or abandonment. The same ruthlessness they had enforced on others now turned inward as paranoia spread and internal executions increased. Fear, once a tool of control, became a source of internal collapse. The violence of this era left deep scars. Entire communities were traumatized not only by what happened, but by the realization that power itself was untrustworthy. Elections, meant to symbolize choice and representation, became associated with death. Politics lost whatever moral authority it still possessed in the eyes of the poor. This chapter of the story exposes a truth that extends far beyond Kenya. Organized violence rarely survives without some level of political tolerance. Criminal groups do not exist in isolation. They grow in the cracks of power, feeding on corruption, fear, and denial. Mungiki's relationship with politics was not an accident. It was a convergence of interests that ended only when the cost became too high. By the end of this period, Mungiki was severely weakened, its leadership decimated, its networks disrupted. But the damage was done. Thousands were dead, countless lives were altered, and the precedent was set. Violence could be both condemned and exploited, depending on who wielded it and when. This moment marks the beginning of the end for Mungiki as an overt force, but not the end of its legacy. The state had reasserted itself, but at a terrible price and without addressing the conditions that had allowed the sect to rise in the first place. When the gunfire faded and the headlines moved on, a dangerous illusion took hold: that Mungiki had been defeated, dismantled, erased. Police briefings spoke of decapitated leadership, disrupted networks, and restored order. For a city exhausted by years of terror, this narrative was comforting. It suggested closure. But history rarely ends so cleanly, especially in places where the roots of violence were never removed. In Nairobi, the aftermath of Mungiki's collapse was not marked by celebration, but by an uneasy quiet. The absence of overt brutality did not feel like peace. It felt like suspension. Communities that had lived under parallel rule for years did not suddenly trust the state simply because the sect was weakened. Fear does not disappear when its source is removed. It lingers, reshaping behavior long after the threat is gone. Former members vanished into the city. Some were killed, others fled. Many simply blended back into neighborhoods that knew exactly who they were, but chose silence over confrontation. Reintegration was never formally addressed. There were no widespread rehabilitation programs, no public reckoning, no truth-telling process that allowed communities to process what had happened. The past was buried without being confronted, creating space for rumors, resentment, and unresolved trauma to grow. For families of victims, closure never came. Bodies were never returned. Deaths were never explained. The line between those killed by Mungiki and those killed by the state blurred beyond recognition. Grief became political and silence became survival. In this environment, justice felt abstract, distant, and selective. The state's reassertion of control was uneven. Police returned to areas once dominated by the sect, but often with the same practices that had fueled resentment before: corruption, intimidation, and violence. Infrastructure remained fragile. Water shortages persisted. Transport costs stayed high. Poverty did not recede. For many residents, the question was not whether Mungiki was gone, but whether anything meaningful had changed. This is where the most uncomfortable question emerges. Did Mungiki disappear, or did it simply adapt? There is evidence that the ideology never fully died. While the centralized structure collapsed, fragments survived. Some former members transitioned into other criminal networks. Others maintained influence through informal intimidation. The rituals faded, but the logic of control endured. Fear had been taught, normalized, internalized. You do not need a sect when people already know how to stay silent. More troubling still is the persistence of the conditions that gave rise to Mungiki in the first place. Urban inequality deepened. Youth unemployment remained high. Informal settlements continued to grow faster than public services. Political promises remained cyclical and unfulfilled. These conditions do not guarantee the return of the same group, but they all but ensure the emergence of something similar. The danger lies not in the name, but in the pattern. When the state is absent, alternative authorities appear. When dignity is denied, identity becomes weaponized. When fear works, it is reused. The lesson of Mungiki is not about one sect's brutality, but about the environment that made brutality effective. For younger generations growing up after Mungiki's peak, the stories sound almost unreal. Beheadings in the streets, bodies used as warnings. Entire neighborhoods controlled by an invisible hand. Yet the behavioral residue remains. Parents still warn children not to speak too much. Community leaders still measure their words carefully. Trust in institutions remains thin. There is also a moral cost that rarely enters official discussions. When violence becomes normalized, it reshapes how people understand power. Many learned that force, not law, resolves conflict, that silence, not truth, ensures safety. That authority belongs to whoever can enforce it. These lessons are difficult to unlearn, and they weaken societies long after the violence ends. From a distance, it is tempting to view Mungiki as an aberration, a dark chapter now closed. But doing so avoids responsibility. It allows political leaders to claim victory without accountability. It allows institutions to avoid reform. It allows society to forget the warning signs that were ignored the first time. The real legacy of Mungiki is not measured in the number of members arrested or killed, but in the questions it leaves behind. What happens when the state fails its most vulnerable citizens? How easily can culture be manipulated into coercion? How quickly does fear replace legitimacy? And perhaps most importantly, what rises next if nothing changes? History suggests that silence is not stability. It is preparation. The absence of visible terror does not mean the absence of risk. It means the system is waiting for another group, another ideology, another generation to step into the same vacuum. This final chapter does not end with certainty, because certainty would be dishonest. Mungiki as it once existed may never return, but the forces that created it remain dangerously familiar, and until those forces are confronted, Nairobi's quiet will always carry an echo of what once ruled through